all right. Tonight, this is Soapbox After Dark. Mrs. Thomas is not in a good mood, so this is a good time for her to be left to her devices. And I want to have a conversation about. It's a conversation that I started with Garland Nixon. Him and I were talking yesterday, and we were in a conversation talking about Tulsi Gabbard. We ended up on this thing of who got it right and why. Meaning, it's one thing to shame and name, to kind of point out how mainstream media got this story so magnificently wrong, how they spent 2 years hyping what amounted to an entire conspiracy theory, how they got it wrong. One new development after the next. Oh my God, the walls are closing in on Donald Trump at any day now. This is going to be the end of Donald Trump. In some cases, going so far as to come up with stories that would literally mean the impeachment of the President of the United States, many of which were retracted, all of which were based on something that just wasn't founded. I don't doubt that Donald Trump is corrupt. None of these people who are on the left who got this right doubted that Donald Trump is corrupt. They don't necessarily even doubt, meaning all of the people who are on the left who got this right didn't even necessarily doubt that the Russian government might have involved itself in order to try to game the system to some degree. Countries do that. Israel invades in our politics. Hell, they were trying to get through American politics to essentially get a waiver in the United Nations after the Obama administration finally decided that it wasn't going to abide Israel, the murdering of human beings anymore. Not to mention Saudi Arabia and the money that they give. You think they were giving that money to the Clinton campaign or to Clinton's quote unquote charity for just because they loved human beings and they wanted the best for the world? They were buying political influence. It's what countries do. That doesn't necessarily surprise me. So I want to make that clear. This wasn't a situation where people didn't necessarily have an appraisal of reality. The appraisal of reality was, yeah, that's possible, but you haven't necessarily been able to demonstrate it. And that was kind of the key point that all of these lefties made from the beginning of this. And it's, for the most part, what they stuck by, and it ended up being right. It ended up being right. I want to talk about a few points. The first point is the incentives that led to openness. Because you've heard me make the argument before that there were incentives built into the process that media and Democrats ran with. They were incentivized not to look too, low behind the scenes, because for the most part, it was a soothing realization to believe that their candidate didn't lose for her own merits, that she lost because that Donald Trump was somehow getting the help of a foreign government. This was soothing to the ears of Democrats, but it was also to some degree soothing to a media that hated Donald Trump's guts, not to mention advantageous to their budgets, especially if we're talking about MSNBC. I think the same thing is true, however, for people who got it right, meaning there was an incentive to openness. The people behind me aren't godlike. They didn't have any special information. There wasn't anything that, that gave them some kind of secret information into where they can peer into the truthfulness of what the world is. They were working off the same information base that everybody was. So why did they get it right? My argument is there was an incentive to openness, or incentive to skepticism of the main competing narrative. The first thing that people need to realize is that lefties tend to not take the American perspective arbitrarily. Meaning, lefties tend to be humanists and tend to look at themselves as a citizens of the world, as opposed to taking this kind of handed down point of view of whatever the American elite is trying to put over the American public. That's the first point. The second point, in regards to incentiveness to openness or skepticism. After the 2016 election, lefties considered themselves something distinct from the party. Meaning it wasn't a situation of competing interests within the same political system. It was something separate and distinct from the prevailing Democratic Party as the Democratic Party was operating. This allowed a certain skepticism to the competing narrative that was coming out, or to the main narrative that the Democratic Party was putting out, as in, we were cheated. especially when WikiLeaks was publishing this information and they kept going with this idea that this was kind of Russian psyop. We were cheated. That's what essentially the Democratic mantra went. Well, lefties at this point didn't consider themselves Democrats and wasn't on the same wavelength that was open to receiving this narrative all that lightly, especially when what they were trying to sell was that Russians cheated us by exposing factually true information that showed us cheating Bernie Sanders. You can see how that doesn't necessarily go down all that well for people who realize and accepted that the Democratic Party cheated Sanders. Right off the bat, you can see a somewhat opposition forming just based on the basic narrative that the Democratic Party is running with. This narrative goes in contrast to essentially a large segment of the population that considers themselves on the left. The second part to this, and I think this part is just as valid and just as prevalent. The left has made the argument of illegitimacy, that your status quo candidate who ran $1 billion campaign, who had all the media organizations backing her, who had all of the publication organizations backing her, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Washington Post, etc., backing her, and even had a multi-million-dollar Twitter army backing her. And she lost. She completely lost. It's true that she won more than 3 million votes, but all of those came out of California. She got the stuffing beat out of her if you remove California. And I'm not ragging on California, I'm just making the point that the rest of the country was beat red. She lost. Now, the argument of the left is you lost the House, the Senate, the Supreme Court, you lost the presidency, and you lost 1,100 seats all throughout the United States. Any claim to legitimacy that you had went away in those magnificent failures. Now, the Democratic Party, however, tries to make this case of, well, we didn't really lose per se. The status quo candidate didn't lose per se. She lost because Russia helped Donald Trump over the finish line. And because Russia helped Trump over the finish line, your argument about our illegitimacy doesn't necessarily work, especially since Hillary Clinton got 3 million more votes. Now, again, we don't live in a political system where the popular vote matters. We are in a political system where the electoral vote matters. Hillary Clinton knew that going into it, so I don't necessarily take that with any validity. But the underlying point is to try to undermine that argument of your legitimacy went out the window when Hillary Clinton couldn't beat a reality show host. Part of the fight in this is to make sure that it's very clear that she lost on her own merits, not because of any kind of Russian interference. The Democratic Party, however, wants to continue to make that argument. Part of, I would make the case of the position of skepticism or the openness to skepticism also boil down into this one basic point of fighting over why you lost. Why you lost. On a secondary point, after being open to a certain degree of skepticism, there's also this just basic, extraordinarily clear incentive for the Democratic Party to try to absolve themselves of that loss. It's like, oh my God, look how much we lost. I can't believe the level to which we failed. Our ability to protect the nation from the most rapacious, batshit crazy group of Republicans just was up in a dash. All across the United States, including the federal government, we lost on a massive, epic fucking level. Maybe we should engage that. I mean, maybe we need to figure out why we lost. Maybe we need to figure out what the public despised so much in us that we get beat by a blue-collared billionaire who ran a populist campaign to some degree, and some elements, to the left of the party itself. Why is it that the lefties and the policies that these guys espouse are popular across the nation, whereas the upper echelon of the party itself is not? Meaning, how are we so out of kilter? Why are we failing so much? Why does the public perception of the Democratic Party so low? Why do they look at us as such? We were the party of the working class. Why are we no longer receiving that mantle? I know why. It's goddamn Russians. That's what it is. Those other hard questions about the things that we need to do to change in order to appeal to the public itself, of why they would throw themselves at a maniac as opposed to our candidate, why they would do this all across the United States. Why? What is the thing that's in the public that would cause them to do this? Those questions are too hard. Let's just go with the goddamn Russians and hope that people, at a certain point, one or two things would happen. Either Mueller would do what we could not do electorally, meaning take Trump out of that office, or we can damage Trump as it goes through, injuring him in this kind of war of attrition where we can have a slow bleed throughout the next 4 years. That didn't work. Neither of those worked. But I think that was the idea at work. It is easier to try to absolve ourselves from blame by saying the Russians did it. And we don't want to have this conversation about what took place in the 2016 elections, meaning we want to hide the fact that we cheated Bernie Sanders by blaming the goddamn Russians. All incentives went for the Democratic Party to go for this. Meaning any lefty who's looking at this that is already to some degree in opposition with the Democratic Party because this party has lied ferociously in the cheating of Sanders is somewhat skeptical out of the bat on a tale that tries to absolve them of blame of this loss. I guess I'm trying to make this point that there were several factors that were involved that allowed lefties to be somewhat skeptical of this narrative that was being put out. Not to mention, and shattered, they even bring up the fact that Hillary Clinton's team was pushing this idea of Trump and Russia to absolve themselves of blame. Again, lefties weren't special. We are creatures of our environment just like everybody else. And in the same way all of those other groups were incentivized to take a certain disposition, we were too. It's just in this case, our position was correct. So I want to show the lefties here because they deserve recognition. Lee Camp, redacted tonight. Katie Halper, she has a show, I don't remember what it is. The Humanist Report, Mike Figueroa. The indomitable Michael Tracy. That bastard, Jamarl Thomas. The guy with the do is Aaron Matei. Ben Norden, he's been on the show, he's a friend of the show. Glenn Garland Nixon, him and I were the ones that were talking that actually came up with this particular story. Max Blumenthal, I've invited him on the show, but my show is not big enough for him. This is Matt Taibbi. He's a badass. He's awesome. That's Jimmy fucking Dore. That's Nico House. He has a show of his own. That is Kim Iverson. Kim Iverson, she's new to me. That's Glenn Greenwald. He is fucking awesome. That's Kyle Kalinske. That's Tim Black. Tim Black. That's Eugene Perrier. That's Abby Martin. I've invited her back on the show. She said no. And we are back to Lee Camp. All of these lefties had a similar disposition. And they stuck with that in the face of people criticizing, calling us conspiracy theorists, saying bad things about us. That's Aaron Matei. He's too big for my show also. He ghosted my show multiple times. Again, none of these people are godlike. None of these people get it right 100% of the time. They're just human beings. But in this particular case, they did get it right, and they deserve credit for getting it right. While mainstream media went for 2 years with a complete conspiracy theory. Just saying. Oh, and by the way, just to kind of make the point that it was a conspiracy theory from the get-go, and Maddow, well, I do this on a separate video. I'll leave this video specific to what this is. Alright guys, if you enjoy the content, please feel free to share, like, subscribe. You can always support through PayPal or Patreon. I wanted this one to be relatively quick. But yeah. Alright guys, thanks so.